Hey there, welcome to the WTF History Channel, where we dig into the wildest, most jaw-dropping stories from the past, sometimes literally jaw-dropping, as you're about to find out. Picture this. It's 1700, and you're in the Royal Alcazar in Madrid. The dining hall is a vision of opulence. Golden plates, silk napkins, the scent of roasted quail wafting through the air. At the head of the table sits Charles II, ruler of an empire so vast the sun never sets on it. Spain, Naples, Sicily, the Indies, Austria, Burgundy, he's got it all. But here's the kicker. This guy, the most powerful man on earth, can't chew a piece of bread. His servants cut his food like he's a toddler, dabbing drool from a mouth so deformed he can't close it properly. At 39, Charles II is a walking tragedy, his body a wreck of genetic chaos. And this wasn't some random disease or accident. This was the result of a 300-year experiment his family, the Habsburgs, conducted on themselves, a twisted love story with their own DNA that turned their dynasty into a genetic horror show. Today, we're diving into the Habsburg curse, a saga of power, obsession, and a family that bred itself into extinction. Buckle up because this is going to be one heck of a ride. Let's rewind to the late 1400s, when Europe was a chaotic chessboard of kingdoms, duchies. In the middle of this mess is a small Alpine kingdom called Austria, ruled by a guy named Maximilian I. Now, Max wasn't your typical king. While others were raising armies and bankrupting their treasuries on wars, he had a wild idea. Why fight when you can marry? This was revolutionary, and it's where our story kicks off. Maximilian saw Europe as a giant puzzle, and he decided to solve it with wedding vows instead of swords. He started small, but played it smart. He married his son, Philip, to Joanna of Castile, and boom, the Habsburgs had a claim to Spain. Then he arranged for his grandson, Charles, to marry Isabella of Portugal, locking in another kingdom. The Habsburg family motto, let others wage wars, you, happy Austria, marry, wasn't just a catchy line, it was a blueprint for world domination. And for a while, it worked like magic. Each marriage brought new lands, new wealth, new power. Territories expanded without a single battle, and a Habsburg treasury filled up without emptying. Other royal families started copying this playbook, and soon, parts of Italy, chunks of a new world. Their territory was so vast it made other kings green with envy. Maximilian died in 1519, convinced he'd cracked the code for eternal power. His grandson, Charles V, inherited the largest empire in human history. Born in 1500, Charles was the golden boy of this genetic gamble. At 16, he was handed the keys to Spain, Austria, the Holy Roman Empire, the Netherlands, parts of Italy, and trade routes spanning 3 continents. Silver mines in Peru, spice islands in the Philippines. If you drop Charles V into today's world, he'd make billionaires look like they're running lemonade stands. But what made everyone think the Habsburg strategy was pure genius wasn't just his wealth. Charles was the real deal. Sharp, he was the Renaissance monarch everyone wanted to be. Charles played by the family rulebook, marrying his first cousin, Isabella of Portugal, in 1526. It was a political slam dunk. The marriage brought Portuguese trade routes under Habsburg control, secured the Iberian Peninsula, and blocked French expansion. Isabella was brilliant, beautiful, and shared his vision. They produced multiple heirs, and the dynasty seemed unstoppable. European courts looked at them and thought, this is how you build an empire. But if you squinted, you could see the first tiny cracks forming. Court painters like Titian captured Charles in all his glory, but look closely at those portraits. Notice that jaw? It's just a slight protrusion. Barely there, what courtiers called the family look. Isabella had it too, and their kids inherited it, a bit more pronounced, but still within the realm of normal noble features. Court physicians noted higher than average infant mortality, more miscarriages than expected, kids with respiratory issues or delayed speech. Nothing alarming by 16th century standards. Child mortality was brutal for everyone back then, but the patterns were there if you knew where to look. Charles ruled for 40 years, reshaping the world before retiring in 1556, burned out for managing an empire with quill pens and sailing ships. He split his territories between his son, Philip II, and his brother, Ferdinand, then retreated to a Spanish monastery to live out his days in prayer. When he died in 1558, he was certain he'd left his heirs the greatest inheritance ever. And by every measure of the time, he had. Now, let's meet the woman who showed the world what happens when Habsburg DNA starts fighting back. Picture a queen so consumed by love that she attacked her husband's mistress with scissors, hacking off the woman's hair in a jealous rage while the court watched in horror. Then imagine that same queen years later, traveling across Spain at midnight with her dead husband's decomposing corpse, refusing to bury him because she couldn't let him go. This was Joanna of Castile, Charles V's mother, and she was the first big warning sign that something was seriously wrong with the Habsburg bloodline. Joanna was born to rule, intelligent, beautiful, fluent in multiple languages. She was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, the power couple who kicked the Muslims out of Spain and funded Columbus's trip to the New World. On paper, she was the perfect Renaissance princess, destined to lead Castile, one of Europe's heavyweight kingdoms. Her marriage to Philip the Handsome of Burgundy should have been another Habsburg home run, uniting two powerful bloodlines, and spent months away from court, showing up just long enough to get Joanna pregnant before vanishing again. For most royal wives, this would have been tough but manageable. Infidelity was practically part of the noble marriage package, but Joanna's brain didn't do manageable. When Philip was away, she'd pace the palace halls for hours, refuse to eat, and fly into rages that scared the servants. When he came back, she'd cling to him, begging him not to leave. Her jealousy was legendary. She once attacked one of Philip's mistresses with scissors in front of the entire court. Then, in 1506, Philip died suddenly at 28, and Joanna's grief went full-on Gothic horror. She refused to bury him. Instead, she had his body embalmed, placed in a silver coffin, and started a macabre road trip across Spain. For months, her caravan wound through villages at night, because, as a widow, she believed no other man should see her. She'd order the coffin opened at monasteries, kissing Philip's rotting face, arranging his grave clothes, even lying beside the coffin to sleep. This went on for years, with Joanna talking to his corpse like he could hear her. Her father, Ferdinand, saw a chance to grab power. If Joanna was mad, she couldn't rule Castile, so he spread stories that she was possessed by demons, unfit to govern. In 1509, he locked her in a convent at Tordesillas, where she spent the next 46 years in increasingly small, dark rooms. Her son, Charles V, kept her there, finding it politically convenient to have a mad mother who couldn't challenge his authority. Joanna died in 1555, erased from history as a crazy woman. But modern historians think she wasn't born mad. She was born genetically vulnerable. Her obsessive behavior, emotional extremes, and inability to handle stress look a lot like inherited psychiatric conditions that pop up in inbred populations. The cracks Joanna hinted at were starting to look like canyons by the 1650s. Picture Diego Velázquez, Spain's greatest painter, setting up his easel to paint a 5-year-old princess named Margaret Teresa. She's dressed in elaborate silk, her tiny hands posed just so. But as Velázquez studies her face, he sees something that gives him pause. She's beautiful, no doubt, but there's a slight protrusion in her jaw, a vacant look in her eyes, a tilt to her head that suggests breathing isn't as easy as it should be. This little girl is already promised to her uncle, Leopold, the Holy Roman Emperor. She's 5, and her future is already written in her bloodline. Velázquez's masterpiece, Las Meninas, captures Margaret Teresa with subtle honesty. Look closely, and you see the truth he couldn't say out loud. This child is carrying the weight of generations of inbreeding. Her jaw, her posture, her distant eyes, they're not just quirks. They're signs of genetic damage manifesting in real time. But her body told a different story. Pregnancies were brutal. Her first child died young, followed by miscarriages. Then another child who survived but showed even worse Habsburg traits, especially that jaw, now so severe it affected speech and breathing. Margaret's health deteriorated with each pregnancy, her body too frail to handle strain. She died in 1673 at just 21, her life consumed by a system that treated her as a vessel for the bloodline. Back in Spain, these royal daughters, the infantas, were valued only for their ability to marry relatives and bear children, even as their bodies rebelled. Each birth was a roll of the dice, as if political winds could outrun biology. The Habsburgs were feeding their own kids to a genetic monster they'd created, one wedding at a time. The final act of this tragedy plays out in 1686, with Charles II, now 25, trying to rule an empire while barely able to rule his own body. Picture council meetings where ministers strain to understand his garbled speech. Ambassadors writing home about a king whose appearance defies description. Charles wasn't just the last Spanish Habsburg. He was living proof you can't cheat biology forever. His parents, Philip IV and Mariana of Austria, were uncle and niece, but their family tree was so tangled that Charles's inbreeding level was worse than if they'd been siblings. After 16 generations of keeping the blood pure, the Habsburg had created a human so genetically compromised he was a walking catastrophe. That Habsburg jaw, it reached its peak in Charles. His lower jaw jutted out so far his teeth couldn't meet, making chewing impossible. Servants cut his food into tiny pieces, and even then, eating was a grueling ordeal. He suffered epileptic seizures. His empire was crumbling as rivals like France and England sensed weakness and started carving up his territories. By the 1690s, everyone knew the end was near. Charles, in his 30s, but with the body of a sickly child, struggled through meetings, his hands shaking, his speech barely coherent. On November 1st, 1700, he died in the Royal Alcazar, his body finally giving out after 39 years of fighting its own DNA. No children, no heirs, no future. The War of Spanish Succession erupted, reshaping Europe as powers fought over the scraps of his empire. The Habsburg genetic experiment was over, and the score was clear. DNA had won. So why did this happen? Harmful genes are usually masked by healthy ones from unrelated partners. It's like shuffling two different decks of cards. Good cards usually cover the bad ones. But when you marry cousins over and over, you're shuffling the same deck, and the bad cards start piling up. By Charles II's time, the Habsburg genetic deck was so stacked with bad cards that a normal life was impossible. His inbreeding coefficient was 0.254, worse than if his parents were siblings. The Habsburg jaw, caused by recessive genes, got worse each generation as the gene pool shrank. This wasn't just about funny-looking faces. It wrecked immune systems, brains, fertility, everything humans need to survive. The Habsburgs thought they were preserving their bloodline's purity. Instead, they were running a 300-year genetic destruction experiment. After Charles's death, Europe learned the hard way. The War of Spanish Succession raged for 13 years, killing hundreds of thousands and redrawing the map. But something else shifted. Royal families started rethinking their marriage strategies. Uncle-niece matches became less common, and monarchies began looking outside their tight circles. The Austrian Habsburgs, who survived their Spanish cousins, dialed back the most extreme inbreeding, maybe sensing the pattern even if they didn't understand the science. It wasn't until the 19th century, showing exactly how inbreeding compounds damage over time. Today's genetic counseling owes a debt to their mistakes, and modern royals, armed with science, avoid the Habsburg trap. Their story is a cautionary tale etched in tragedy. Strength comes from diversity, not sameness. Thanks for joining us on this insane journey through the Habsburg curse. Keep questioning the past. It's way weirder than you think.